After my wife died, I kept from my son the truth about the massive Wyoming ranch she left me and the $400,000 in hidden cash. 3 weeks later, my son met my eyes and calmly announced they were selling my house to lock me away in a facility. I only smiled. I had already moved my assets and they wouldn't touch a cent. My name is Thomas. I'm 70 years old and I spent my working life as a petroleum engineer. I spent decades out on the rigs working long, punishing shifts so my family would always be secure. My wife Helen and I were married for 42 beautiful years. Together, we built a good life in a quiet upscale suburb of Chicago. Our house became our refuge, a sprawling house that we paid off with our own hard work. We raised our only son, Lucas, with every opportunity we could provide. We paid for his college, helped him out when he married Natalie, and tried to support him without controlling his life. 3 weeks ago, my world fell apart. Helen passed away after a short, brutal illness. Losing her felt as though the air had been pulled from my chest. The house suddenly felt too big and too quiet. Lucas and Natalie came around for the funeral, offering the usual condolences, but they quickly returned to their own lives, leaving me to endure the crushing silence of an empty home. I spent my days moving aimlessly from room to room, touching the furniture. She picked out, smelling her perfume that still lingered in the air, and wondering how I was supposed to live without my compass. Then last Tuesday morning, my phone rang. It was an attorney from a long-established law firm in downtown Chicago. He asked me to come to his office immediately about a private arrangement Helen had arranged years ago. I was confused. Helen and I shared everything. At least I believed we had no secrets. We managed our finances together at the kitchen table every Sunday. But I put on a suit, drove into the city, and sat in a leather chair across from a man who handed me a small brass key. It was an attorney from a long-established law firm. He told me it belonged to a safe deposit box at a private bank just 2 blocks away. The box was in Helen's name, but I was listed as the sole beneficiary upon her passing. I walked to the bank caught between anxiety and curiosity. The vault manager escorted me into a quiet, secure room with metal walls and left me alone with a heavy steel box. My hands trembled as I turned the key and lifted the lid. I expected to find old love letters, maybe some family heirlooms or vintage jewelry she had tucked away for safekeeping. Instead, I found stacks of perfectly bound $100 bills. $400,000 in raw cash. My pulse pounded as I stared at the money. But that wasn't all. Beneath the stacks of cash was a thick manila envelope containing a legal deed and a handwritten letter from my wife. I unfolded the letter, recognizing Helen's elegant handwriting immediately. The ink was slightly faded, written perhaps a decade ago. In the letter, Helen explained everything. The money and the deed belonged to a massive 5,000-acre ranch in Wyoming. It was a secret inheritance from her estranged father. I knew her father had been a difficult, toxic man who used his wealth to control people. Helen had cut ties with him long before we met. What I didn't know was that when he died, he left his entire estate to her. She wrote that she hid this wealth from me and from Lucas because she wanted to protect our family from the toxic influence of unearned money. She wanted Lucas to grow up grounded, to learn the value of hard work and to build his own life without waiting for a handout. She wanted our marriage to be built on love and partnership, not on managing a massive fortune. The greatest surprise was a secondary document attached to the deed. The Wyoming ranch wasn't just sitting empty. It was currently leased to a major mineral and natural gas corporation. That land was producing $50,000 every single month in royalties. This money had been funneling into a private trust for years, untouched. I sat in that quiet metal room for over an hour, overcome with emotion. Helen had carried this massive secret to protect the humble, honest life we built. She was the most incredible woman I had ever known. Tears ran down my face as I held her letter against my chest. I felt a profound sense of gratitude, but also an aching sorrow that she was no longer here to share this with me. Eventually, I composed myself. I placed the documents and the cash securely into my leather briefcase, walked out of the bank, and got into my car. As I drove back to the suburbs, possibilities raced through my mind. The grief was still there, pressing on my shoulders. But now I had a renewed sense of purpose. I thought about Lucas and Natalie. I knew they had been complaining lately about the rising cost of living and the heavy mortgage on their own house. I thought about how much this money could help them. I could pay off their debts. We could take a long family vacation to Europe, just like Helen always wanted. And I could set up a trust fund for my future grandchildren. I pulled into my quiet suburban street, eager to share the bittersweet news. I parked in my driveway, looking up at the beautiful brick facade of the $1.2 million home Helen and I had lovingly maintained. But as I walked up the driveway, I noticed a large unmarked box truck parked near the side entrance. The front door was propped wide open. My stomach tightened. I clutched my briefcase tightly and stepped through the doorway. The sight before me stopped me cold. There were 3 strange men inside my living room. They were aggressively pulling my antique paintings off the walls and wrapping them in thick, moving blankets. Other men were dismantling the heavy oak dining table where Helen and I had hosted Thanksgiving dinner for the last 30 years. The house was in chaos. Boxes were piled in the hallway filled with my personal belongings. And standing right in the center of the living room, holding a clipboard and barking orders at the movers, were my son Lucas and his wife Natalie. I stood there invisible for a moment, struggling to understand the scene. My own flesh and blood was tearing apart my home without a single word of warning. The excitement of the Wyoming ranch vanished at once, replaced by a cold realization that my perfect family was a complete illusion. I cleared my throat loudly. Lucas turned around, his eyes widening for just a fraction of a second before a rehearsed smile crossed his face. He had no idea what was inside my briefcase, and he had no idea that he had challenged a man with nothing left to lose. I stopped in the entryway of my own house. My polished leather shoes felt glued to the hardwood floor as I watched 3 burly men in gray uniforms haul my belongings toward the front door. One of them was currently wrestling with a heavy gilded mirror that Helen and I had purchased on our 10th anniversary in Charleston. Another was carelessly shoving my antique grandfather clock into a thick layer of industrial plastic wrap. The beautiful Persian rug that usually tied the whole living room together was already rolled up and tossed into a dark corner. The entire house was in a state of absolute chaotic ruin, and standing right in the massive center of it all, pointing and directing the movers like a seasoned project manager, was my son, Lucas. He was wearing his expensive designer jeans and a crisp linen shirt, looking perfectly comfortable while tearing apart the sanctuary his mother and I had built. Natalie stepped out from the kitchen, holding a steaming cup of coffee. She was wearing a sharp white blazer, carrying herself as if she already owned the property, and was simply preparing it for an open house. She didn't look like a woman who was actively mourning her beloved mother-in-law. She looked satisfied. I gripped the handle of my heavy leather briefcase tightly. Inside sat $400,000 in raw cash and the legal key to a future they knew nothing about. Lucas spun around. For a fraction of a second, his eyes widened in sheer panic. But then a rehearsed smile crossed his face. It was the face he used when he was trying to sell a terrible financial deal to a wealthy client at his firm. "Dad," Lucas said, his voice coated in false sweetness that instantly turned my stomach, "we didn't expect you back from the city so soon. I thought you told us you were going to be out all afternoon dealing with the estate lawyers." "What exactly is going on here, Lucas?" I asked, keeping my voice controlled despite the rage bubbling in my chest. "Why are there strange men in my house taking down my wife's paintings without my permission?" Natalie gracefully walked over and stood right beside him. "Thomas, please try to stay calm," she said, deliberately raising her voice so the movers could hear her clearly. It was a calculated move designed to make me look like an unstable, emotional old man who was losing his grip on reality. "We are just trying to help you. We know how hard these past 3 weeks have been for you since Helen passed away." "Help me," I repeated, looking around the devastated living room once more. "You are actively dismantling my home. Natalie, the house I paid off with 40 years of hard work on the oil rigs. Lucas sighed heavily, crossing his arms over his chest in a defensive posture. He walked over to the glass coffee table, picking up a glossy, colorful brochure. He held it out to me with a look of profound, staged pity that made my stomach physically churn. "We need to be realistic, Dad," Lucas said softly, stepping a few inches closer. "You are 70 years old now. You are living in a massive 5-bedroom house all by yourself. The daily maintenance is simply too much for you to handle alone. The memories in this house are wearing you down and breaking your heart. You have been wandering around like a lost ghost since Mom died. It is not safe for you to be living here by yourself anymore." He slid the brochure smoothly across the surface of the coffee table. I looked down at it. The cover featured a group of sad elderly people sitting in wheelchairs on a patchy dying lawn. The bold letters across the top read, "Brookside Manors Assisted Living Facility." It wasn't a luxury retirement community. It was an underfunded state nursing home. A depressing, bleak facility where greedy families dumped their elderly relatives when they no longer wanted to deal with the burden of caring for them. "We have decided it's time, Dad," Lucas continued, his tone hardening, just a fraction losing that fake layer of warmth. "We are selling your house. It is the absolute best thing for your physical health and your long-term future." Natalie stepped right up behind him, resting her perfectly manicured hands on his shoulders. She flashed me a cold smirk. It was a look of undeniable triumph. She honestly believed she had won the grand prize. She believed she was dealing with a broken, grieving widower who would simply fold under their intense pressure and quietly sign away his entire life. Soon, for a brief, foolish moment, I actually felt a wave of deep pity for them. I looked at my only son, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle in this very driveway, the boy I had stayed up with late into the night helping with complex math homework. I wondered how much serious debt they must be hiding to resort to something so vile. I wondered what kind of severe financial ruin had pushed them to try and steal my home out from under me. My grip on the leather briefcase relaxed slightly. I realized I had the power to fix this entire terrible situation then and there. I had $400,000 in raw cash sitting right there in my hand. I could easily pay off their overwhelming mortgage. I could clear whatever secret debts were currently drowning them in desperation. I could give them a clean start. All I had to do was open the briefcase, show them the legal deed to the Wyoming ranch, and tell them that we were going to be okay. I took a deep, steadying breath, preparing to smile, preparing to be the forgiving, generous father who saves the day one last time. I opened my mouth to speak, to tell them about Helen's incredible secret gift, to tell them about the $50,000 a month in mineral royalties that would secure our family for generations to come. But before the wonderful words could leave my throat, my eyes drifted back down to the glass coffee table. Sitting right next to that highly insulting nursing home brochure was a thick stack of legal documents. They were partially covered by a plain manila folder, but the top page was clearly visible under the harsh living room lights. It was a standard state legal document. The bold black letters at the very top of the page read, "Durable power of attorney." My breath caught sharply in my throat. I stepped closer to the table, my eyes rapidly scanning the dense text of the document. It granted full, unconditional legal control of my personal finances, my private medical decisions, and my real estate assets directly to Lucas. It gave him the legal authority to sell my house, drain my bank accounts, and commit me to a psychiatric facility against my will. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. At the absolute bottom of the page, right next to a bright red official notary seal, was my signature. It was a near-perfect forgery of my specific handwriting. The hopeful smile vanished from my face. The fatherly pity I felt for my son evaporated into the thin air, replaced by icy clarity. They weren't just trying to force me to sell my home through emotional manipulation. They had already stolen it behind my back. They had committed fraud to legally strip me of my human rights, my financial independence, and my basic dignity. I slowly looked up from the forged document and met my son's gaze directly. Lucas was no longer smiling, his fake, reassuring smile. He saw exactly what I was looking at. He saw the dark realization cross my face. But instead of apologizing, instead of showing even a single ounce of human guilt, he just stared back at me with cold defiance in his eyes. They thought I was weak. They thought my deep grief had made me permanently blind and helpless. But they had no idea what I had hidden inside my briefcase. And they had no idea what a man who has lost his beloved wife and his only son in the same month is truly capable of doing to protect his legacy. I kept my eyes locked on Lucas for a long moment before I slowly raised my hand and pointed a trembling finger at the glass coffee table. I made sure to let my hand shake, playing into the narrative they had already constructed in their minds. I needed them to believe that I was just an overwhelmed, confused old man who was out of his depth. "Lucas," I said, letting my voice waver just enough to sound vulnerable, "what exactly is that document sitting right there next to the nursing home brochure? Why does it have my signature on it?" "I have no memory of signing any legal papers since your mother passed away." The tension in the spacious living room shifted instantly. The cold, defiant challenge in Lucas's eyes vanished, replaced by a sudden, frantic calculation. He glanced at Natalie silently, asking her to take the lead. Natalie didn't hesitate. The cruel, triumphant smirk that had been plastered across her face just moments ago melted away in an instant. In the blink of an eye, she transformed into a picture of concern. Her posture softened, her shoulders dropped, and she let out a long, sympathetic sigh that sounded so remarkably genuine it almost made me doubt my own sanity. She walked over to the coffee table with slow, measured steps, ignoring the forged power of attorney document. Instead, she reached for a thick, unmarked manila folder that had been sitting just beneath it. She picked it up, carefully, clutching it to her chest. As she approached me, her dark eyes were swimming with false sorrow. "Thomas, we didn't want to have this conversation like this," Natalie murmured softly, reaching out to gently touch my forearm. I had to force myself not to pull away from her touch. "We were trying to spare you the profound pain of facing the harsh reality of your current medical situation." "My medical situation?" I echoed, furrowing my brow in feigned confusion. "I'm healthy, my heart is strong, and my blood pressure is normal." "What on earth are you talking about, Natalie?" She opened the manila folder and pulled out a stack of crisp hospital records. I recognized the official letterhead immediately. It was from the same private hospital where Helen had spent her final days. Natalie flipped to the third page and handed it to me with a look of theatrical sadness. "We spoke to Dr. Bennett on the day Helen passed," she said, her voice dropping to a gentle, comforting whisper. "He was concerned about you, Thomas. He pulled Lucas aside in the hallway and asked him to keep a very close eye on your deteriorating mental state." I looked down at the document in my trembling hands. It was a genuine medical chart stamped and dated by Helen's primary physician. But highlighted in yellow marker near the bottom of the page was a handwritten note added to the margins. It read, "Patient's husband is showing severe signs of grief-induced cognitive decline. Recommend immediate psychiatric evaluation and full-time supervision to prevent accidental self-harm." I stared at those highlighted words, my mind struggling to grasp how they had managed to secure something so damning. Dr. Bennett was a busy man. I had barely spoken to him during Helen's final hours because I was too busy holding her fragile hand and praying for a miracle. Lucas must have cornered him in the chaotic hospital corridor, spinning a tragic tale of an unstable, weeping father who was losing his mind. They had planted the dark seed of my insanity, before my wife had even been laid to rest, before I could even process the sheer depth of their betrayal. Lucas stepped forward and gripped both my hands. His grip was tight, almost restrictive, as if he were trying to physically anchor me to the hardwood floor. He looked deep into my eyes, and for a fleeting second, I almost believed the intense, overwhelming sorrow written across his face. He was a talented liar. Dad, you have to listen to us, Lucas pleaded, his voice cracking with staged emotion. You are not well. The grief has shattered your mind. You just do not realize how bad it has actually gotten over these last 3 agonizing weeks. I'm fine, I protested weakly, continuing my performance. I'm just mourning your beautiful mother. That is perfectly normal for a man who just lost his entire world. It is not just mourning, Dad, Lucas insisted, squeezing my hands tighter. You have been wandering around this massive house in the middle of the night talking to the walls. Last Tuesday, Natalie came over to drop off some groceries, and she found the front door wide open and the gas stove left burning on high. You could have burned the entire house down, Dad. You have stopped eating unless we physically put the food right in front of you. You are slipping away from us, and I can't bear the thought of losing you right after losing Mom. I stared at my son in absolute disbelief. None of what he was saying was remotely true. I had never left the stove on. I had never ever left the heavy front door wide open. I had been perfectly capable of making my own meals and maintaining my daily routine. They were building a false history, building a convincing legal narrative of my rapid mental collapse. They were rewriting reality in my own living room, slowly tightening the invisible noose around my neck. I honestly, truly do not remember any of that happening, I whispered, letting my gaze drop to the floor, projecting the pitiful image of a broken, deeply confused elder. We know you do not remember, Thomas, Natalie chimed in, stepping closer to gently rub my back in a soothing motion. That is exactly why we had to step in immediately. That is why we had to take full control of the situation before you accidentally hurt yourself. I slowly looked back up at the glass coffee table, pointing a shaking finger at the forged legal document one more time. But my signature, I didn't sign that paper, Lucas. I would never sign over my entire life to you without reading the terms. Lucas released my trembling hands and took a deep, steadying breath. He looked deeply and directly into my eyes, his facial expression shifting perfectly into one of solemn conviction. He stood tall, projecting the heroic image of a highly devoted son making a terrible, heavy sacrifice for the greater good of his aging, ailing father. We forged it to save you the stress of paperwork. Dad, Lucas confessed softly, his voice echoing with unapologetic conviction in the silent, empty living room. We are actively selling the house to get you into a premium, round-the-clock luxury care facility where you will always be safe. We are simply just protecting you. I heard the words leaving my son's mouth, but my brain refused to accept them. For a long moment, we forged it to save you the stress. We are just protecting you. The lie was so brazen and hollow that rage surged through me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to reach across that glass coffee table, grab the collar of his expensive linen shirt, and physically throw him out of my house. I wanted to pull the $400,000 in cash from my briefcase and throw it in his deceitful face, too. Watch his world crumble. But I didn't move. I'm a retired petroleum engineer. My entire career was built on remaining calm during high-pressure blowouts on offshore drilling rigs. When combustible gas fills the air, you do not panic. You analyze the structural integrity of the system, identify the lethal threats, and follow a precise sequence to survive the explosion. Right now, I was looking at a catastrophic blowout. If I fought them right here, I would lose everything. Lucas had just shown me the ultimate weapon. He had a medical document signed by a legitimate doctor claiming I was suffering from severe grief-induced cognitive decline. If I raised my voice, if I showed anger, if I called the police to report the forgery, Natalie would immediately use that exact anger as proof of my mental instability. They would call the authorities, show them the highlighted note, and use the forged power of attorney to legally drag me out of my own home. I would be locked away in a psychiatric ward before the sun went down, stripped of every human right I possessed. I realized with cold clarity that I was trapped in a corner. The only way to survive this trap was to make them believe it. Had worked perfectly. I had to play the fool. I had to become the broken version of me that they desperately needed me to be. I let out a long, shaky breath, making sure it sounded like a heavy sigh of defeat. I let my posture collapse. letting my shoulders slump forward as if the weight of grief was suddenly too much for my fragile bones to bear. I lowered my chin, breaking eye contact with Lucas, and stared blankly at the floorboards. I let my hands drop to my sides, allowing my grip on the heavy leather briefcase to loosen just enough to look harmless. "You really think this is for the best, Lucas?" I asked, keeping my voice very soft, injecting it with a frail, wavering tone of confusion. "You really think I can't take care of myself anymore?" Lucas immediately seized the opportunity to solidify his victory. He placed his hands on my shoulders, his grip firm and patronizing. "I know it's hard to hear, Dad, but yes, we honestly believe this is the only way to keep you safe. You need professional care. The facility we found is wonderful. You will be comfortable, and you will not have to worry about maintaining this giant empty house anymore. Let us handle all the complicated legal paperwork. You just need to rest and focus on finding some peace," Natalie chimed in, her voice dripping with that same false concern. "We will pack up your essential clothes and a few nice photographs of Helen to take with you to your new room, Thomas. You do not need to lift a single finger. We have everything under control." I nodded slowly, deliberately, making my movements sluggish and unsure. I raised a trembling hand to my face and rubbed my eyes, pretending to wipe away tears of overwhelmed exhaustion. "I am just so tired," I mumbled softly, letting my words slur together just a fraction. "I am so tired, Lucas. I miss your mother so much." "Nothing makes any sense without her." "We know, Dad," Lucas said, patting my shoulder with a hollow, rehearsed affection. "Just go to your room and lie down. We will finish directing the movers and handle the rest of the packing out here. We will wake you when it's time to have dinner." I nodded one last time, turned around, and began to slowly shuffle down the long hallway toward my master bedroom. I dragged my feet across the hardwood floor, making sure my steps sounded heavy and defeated. Every fiber of my being wanted to turn around and fight, but my mind kept forcing my body to play the part. I reached my bedroom, opened the door, and stepped inside and gently closed it behind me. The moment the bedroom door clicked shut, the frail, confused old man vanished completely. I stood up straight, my breathing steady and my mind razor sharp. I quietly locked the door and placed my heavy leather briefcase securely inside the bottom drawer of my heavy oak dresser, burying it beneath a stack of thick winter sweaters. I sat down on the edge of the mattress, listening to the muffled sounds of the movers dismantling the rest of my home. I could hear the heavy thud of my furniture being dragged across the floor. I could hear Natalie giving sharp, commanding orders, her fake, sweet voice replaced by her natural, authoritative tone. I sat there in the fading afternoon light, mapping out every possible angle of my defense. I needed solid proof. I needed to uncover the real reason they were rushing to liquidate a $1 million asset. This forged power of attorney and the sudden lie about a nursing home were desperate measures. People only resort to desperate, highly illegal measures when they're backed into a terrifying financial corner. I knew Lucas. I knew he was arrogant and careless. He would leave a digital trail, a paper trail, or a verbal clue. I just needed to find it. I stayed in my bedroom for the rest of the evening. When Natalie eventually knocked on the door to offer me a plate of bland, unseasoned chicken and rice, I accepted it with a weak, grateful smile, maintaining the act. I left the food mostly untouched, reinforcing their belief that I was rapidly declining. Night eventually fell, covering the chaotic, half-empty house in a thick blanket of heavy silence. Lucas and Natalie had decided to sleep in the guest room to keep a close eye on the property and presumably to keep a close eye on me. I lay awake in my bed for hours staring up at the dark ceiling, my mind running through complex legal strategies and potential countermeasures. At around 2 a.m, my throat felt dry. I carefully threw off the heavy blankets and swung my legs over the side of the bed. I didn't turn on any lights. I knew the layout of my home, even in the darkness. I silently opened my bedroom door and padded barefoot down the long hallway toward the kitchen. The house felt empty and stripped of its soul, without the familiar antique furniture filling the spaces. I reached the kitchen and silently filled a glass with cold tap water. As I raised the glass to my lips, a faint blue light caught my attention. I slowly lowered the glass and looked through the large bay window that overlooked the backyard patio, standing outside in the cool night air, illuminated only by the harsh blue glow of her smartphone screen, was Natalie. She was pacing back and forth across the stone pavers, her arms crossing and uncrossing in quick agitated movements. She was whispering furiously into her cell phone, looking over her shoulder every few seconds to make sure she was alone. I pressed my back flat against the cool plaster of the kitchen wall, holding my breath so tightly that my chest began to ache. Natalie was standing just a few feet away on the other side of the glass. The pale moonlight cast long, distorted shadows across the cold stone patio. I slowly set my glass of water down on the granite counter, making sure the base didn't make the slightest clink. My eyes remained fixed on my daughter-in-law. She was still pacing, her movements sharp and erratic. The soft blue light from her smartphone screen illuminated her face, highlighting an intense, almost manic expression that I had never seen her wear during the day. I needed to know what was causing her so much profound panic in the middle of the night. I silently crept closer to the bay window. The old wooden frame had a slight gap near the bottom latch, a tiny structural flaw I had meant to fix last summer. I carefully placed my fingers on the brass handle and applied just enough upward pressure to crack the window open a fraction of an inch more. The cool night breeze instantly slipped into the dark kitchen, carrying with it the faint, muffled sound of her hushed and secretive voice. I strained my ears, closing my eyes to focus on the fragmented audio. I couldn't make out the words she was speaking. The rustling wind through the oak trees in the backyard masked the specific details of her frantic conversation, but I could distinctly hear the sharp, aggressive tone of her delivery. She wasn't talking to Lucas. The cadence of her voice was wrong for a conversation with her husband. She sounded defensive, almost pleading at certain moments, and then immediately snapping back with a harsh, demanding edge. It sounded exactly like a high-stakes negotiation coming apart. She ran a hand through her hair, shaking her head vigorously as she listened to whatever the person on the other end of the line was telling her. I watched her end the call abruptly, her fingers trembling slightly as she shoved the phone deep into the pocket of her sleek blazer. She stood still for a moment, staring out into the dark expanse of the manicured lawn as if she were waiting for something to jump out from the thick shadows. Then she let out a long, ragged breath and reached into her other pocket. What she pulled out made my blood run cold. It was a familiar bright orange plastic bottle. I recognized the label instantly. It was the expensive premium memory supplement that Natalie had so graciously purchased for me earlier that week. She had handed it to me with such a sweet, caring smile, telling me that the natural vitamins would help clear away the heavy mental fog caused by my deep grief. She had even bought a weekly pill organizer, carefully sorting the capsules for me so I wouldn't have to worry about remembering my daily dosage. I watched in paralyzed horror as she unscrewed the cap of the orange bottle. She didn't take a pill for herself. Instead, she walked over to the edge of the patio right where Helen used to plant her rose bush. Natalie crouched down, opened the plastic bottle, and began pulling apart the large gelatin capsules one by one. She deliberately tipped the capsules upside down, dumping the fine, natural herbal powder directly into the dark, damp garden dirt. She did this one by one, emptying capsule after capsule until there was a small mound of discarded powder hidden beneath the rose bush. My mind raced, trying to comprehend the calculation of her actions. Why would she empty out the expensive supplements she had insisted I take every single morning? The answer to that question came a few seconds later. Natalie stood back up and pulled a small clear Ziploc bag from the inside pocket of her blazer. Even from my hidden and secure vantage point inside the pitch-black silent kitchen, I could clearly see that the bag was filled with a strange crushed white powder. It didn't look like any commercial medication I had ever seen. It looked crude, chalky, and unnatural to my eyes. She smoothly placed the empty gelatin capsules on the flat surface of the stone patio table. Her hands moved with a practiced precision. She carefully scooped the crushed white powder from the Ziploc bag, meticulously refilling each and every empty capsule with the unknown substance. She was focused. Her eyes narrowed in intense concentration as she packed the toxic powder tightly into the innocent-looking pills. She snapped the two halves of the gelatin capsules back together, sealing the sinister secret safely inside. She was silently manufacturing a lethal weapon right in my very own backyard. I watched her wipe the excess white dust from her fingers, brushing it casually onto her expensive slacks. She took the freshly filled capsules and carefully placed them one by one into the plastic compartments of my weekly pill organizer. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. She systematically filled every single slot with the dangerously contaminated medication, making sure each dose looked identical to the original herbal vitamins. A wave of nausea swept over me as the horrible, twisted truth finally became clear. The heavy mental fog, the intense lethargy, the strange, frightening gaps in my short-term memory over the past 2 agonizing weeks. It wasn't the natural expected byproduct of my profound, overwhelming grief. It wasn't my 70-year-old brain slowly shutting down from the severe trauma of losing my wife. It was deliberate chemistry. It was poison running through my veins. They were intentionally drugging me to fabricate the medical symptoms they needed to carry out their legal takeover. They were damaging my mind from within so that when the doctors examined me, the diagnosis of severe cognitive decline would become undeniable and legally binding. Natalie snapped the plastic lid of the pill organizer shut with a sharp, sudden click that echoed loudly in the quiet night air. She confidently tucked the empty Ziploc bag back into the inside pocket of her blazer, picked up the organizer, and turned around to head back toward the house. I immediately pushed myself away from the window, retreating silently into the darkest hidden corner of the kitchen, pressing my entire body flat against the cold metal of the refrigerator. I held my breath, squeezing my eyes shut in sheer panic as the heavy sliding glass door slowly slid open and she stepped confidently onto the kitchen tiles. I could hear her soft, steady footsteps moving deliberately past me, passing just a few short feet away in the absolute darkness. She walks back inside and sets the pill organizer on the counter. I realize I'm not losing my mind. My own family is actively trying to poison my brain. I stayed pressed against the cold metal of the refrigerator for what felt like hours after Natalie left the kitchen. My heart hammered against my ribs with a violent rhythmic intensity. The reality of my situation closed around me. I wasn't a grieving widower suffering from a tragic cognitive decline. I was a target. My own son and daughter-in-law were systematically poisoning my mind to forcefully seize my assets. I didn't sleep that night. I lay stiffly in my bed, staring at the ceiling, carefully calculating my next physical movements. When morning finally broke, pouring pale sunlight through my bedroom blinds, I knew exactly what I had to do. I shuffled into the kitchen wearing my oldest robe, heavily dragging my feet. Natalie was standing by the marble island, sipping a fresh cup of coffee. She offered me a bright, cheerful morning greeting and slid the plastic pill organizer toward me. I picked up the small toxic capsule with trembling fingers. I raised a glass of water to my lips, placed the pill inside my mouth, and took a large, loud gulp. Natalie watched me closely, a flash of satisfaction in her eyes as she believed I had ingested the poison. But I had smoothly tucked the capsule deep under my tongue. The moment she turned her back to check her phone, I spit the dissolving capsule into a paper napkin and shoved it deep into the pocket of my robe. Lucas came downstairs a few minutes later, adjusting his expensive silk tie. They kissed each other goodbye, offered me a few fake, patronizing words of comfort, and finally walked out the front door. I stood by the front window, holding my breath as I watched their luxury sedan pull out of the driveway and disappear down the quiet suburban street. The moment their car turned the final corner, the broken old man act vanished. My posture straightened. The lingering mental fog that had plagued me for weeks was already beginning to lift, replaced by the sharp focus of a seasoned engineer. I immediately turned around and marched straight down the hallway toward Lucas's home office. The room was meticulously organized, filled with modern minimalist furniture that Helen had always hated. Sitting in the very center of his sleek glass desk was his high-end custom-built desktop computer. Lucas was arrogant, but he wasn't nearly as smart as he believed himself to be. I was the one who had physically sourced and assembled every single internal component of that powerful machine for him last Christmas. More importantly, I knew the predictable habits of his mind. Lucas always thought he was outsmarting everyone around him, but he relied on lazy, repetitive logic. I sat down in his expensive leather office chair and tapped the keyboard. The large monitor flared to life, displaying a password prompt over a high-resolution background image of a tropical beach. I didn't hesitate. I typed. In the name of his childhood dog, followed by the year he graduated from his prestigious business school. The screen unlocked at once, granting me access to the hidden corners of his digital life. My hands flew across the keyboard with practiced precision. The very first thing I needed to verify was the luxury nursing home they had so confidently promised me. I opened his primary web browser and accessed his detailed search history. I filtered the vast logs for the past 3 weeks, looking for any combination of words related to elderly care, premium assisted living, or medical facilities. I combed through hundreds of digital footprints. There was nothing. They hadn't spent a single second researching a safe place for me to live. The glossy brochure Lucas had placed on the coffee table was nothing more than a cheap prop designed to manipulate me into submission. I broadened my search parameters, diving deeper into his daily internet activity. What I found instead made my jaw tightly clench. Lucas's browser history was flooded with extensive research into offshore banking regulations, anonymous shell companies, and expedited citizenship applications for Caribbean nations. He had spent hours poring over detailed listings for sprawling beachfront villas in the Bahamas and browsing the rental rates for massive luxury yachts. The digital trail painted a grim picture of a man who was actively preparing to flee the country with a massive sum of liquid cash. I opened a new tab and quickly bypassed the weak security on his personal financial dashboard. The screen populated with a staggering list of his active accounts, and the sheer volume of red numbers instantly validated every dark suspicion I harbored. Lucas and Natalie were drowning in catastrophic debt. They had maxed out multiple high-limit credit cards on lavish vacations, designer wardrobes, and fine dining. But the most alarming discovery was a glaring final notice from an unregulated offshore lending firm. The aggressive, threatening language in the digital document detailed a delinquent loan of $800,000. They had leveraged their entire future on high-risk speculative investments that had clearly imploded, leaving them at the mercy of dangerous people. They weren't forcing me out of my home simply because they were greedy. They were sacrificing my life because they were cornered people trying to save their own skins from a syndicate that wouldn't hesitate to destroy them. They needed the $1.2 million from the sale of my house to pay off the terrifying debt and fund their escape to a tropical paradise, leaving me abandoned in a bleak, windowless state-run asylum. My chest heaved with a cold, calculated fury as I minimized the financial dashboard. I needed to see exactly how far along they were in this sickening process. I opened his primary email client, bypassing another simple password, and navigated straight to his private inbox. I bypassed his daily work correspondence and sorted the incoming messages by attachments. My eyes immediately locked onto a highly active, ongoing email thread between Natalie and an unknown, unlisted email address. I clicked on the conversation thread. The contact name simply read broker. There was no official agency listed, no professional signature, and no corporate company logo to verify his identity. It was clearly a shady, unlicensed real estate contact operating under the table to move properties rapidly. I slowly scrolled down to the very first urgent message Natalie had sent him late last night. It was sent right around the same time I had watched her pacing frantically on the backyard patio, clutching her phone in the dark. My eyes quickly scanned the cold words she had hastily typed out in the message body, and my blood instantly turned to ice as I realized her ultimate plan. They were pushing forward with ruthless speed, and they were fully preparing to execute the final phase of their terrifying betrayal before the upcoming weekend even officially arrived. I stared at the glowing computer screen, my eyes tracing the cruel words Natalie had typed to the unlicensed broker. The message was brief, cold, and without empathy. She had written, "List the house 30% below market value immediately. We do not care about getting a fair price. We need the cash by this Friday. No exceptions. Do not worry about the current owner. The old man is too heavily medicated to know what he is signing anyway." Her callous message hit me like a blow. She wasn't just plotting to steal my home. She was actively mocking my perceived mental decline, treating my life as nothing more than a convenient disposable stepping stone to save her own skin. I sat in Lucas's expensive leather office chair, my hands gripping the armrest so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My own son, the boy I had raised with every ounce of love and dedication I possessed, had brought this ruthless, calculating woman into our family. Together, they had meticulously orchestrated a plan to strip me of my dignity, my home, and my future. They were willing to discard me in a windowless, low-income asylum just to cover up their catastrophic financial mistakes. The betrayal ran so deep it felt like a jagged knife twisting violently in my gut. I read the terrible email one more time, burning every single word into my memory. I needed to remember this exact feeling of profound violation. I needed to use this intense burning anger to fuel my next sequence of actions. I reached out and closed the email client, making sure I didn't alter the read status of the message. I cleared the browser history of my own search queries, covering my digital tracks so Lucas would never suspect that his insecure computer had been compromised. I locked the desktop screen, restoring the bright, tropical beach background to its original state. I stood up from the desk, my legs feeling slightly unsteady as the massive weight of their deception pressed down on my shoulders. I walked out of the home office and stepped back into the wide, quiet hallway. The house felt empty and foreign to me now. It was no longer the warm, loving sanctuary where Helen and I had shared so many beautiful decades together. It had become a hostile, dangerous battleground. I needed to formulate a counterattack, and I needed to do it with speed. Friday was only 2 days away. That gave me less than 48 hours to dismantle their scheme and secure my own safety. I began to pace slowly across the remaining rugs in the living room, my mind churning through complex legal strategies and potential escape routes. I had the $400,000 in cash, and I had the Wyoming ranch deed. I possessed the financial firepower to destroy their plans, but I needed a strong legal shield to execute. My strike. As I turned toward the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water, the sudden sharp chime of the front doorbell shattered the heavy silence of the house. I froze in my tracks. Lucas and Natalie were at work. We weren't expecting any deliveries, and the movers had finished their preliminary packing the previous afternoon. I cautiously walked toward the foyer, my heart beginning to race with a sudden dread. I approached the heavy wooden front door and peered through the small, distorted glass peephole. Standing on my front porch was a huge, imposing man. He was wearing a dark leather jacket over a plain black t-shirt, and his thick neck was covered in dark, aggressive tattoos. He didn't look like a salesman, and he certainly didn't look like a friendly neighborhood visitor. He looked like violence given human form. I hesitated, my hand hovering nervously over the brass deadbolt. I considered ignoring the bell, hoping he would simply walk away and leave me in peace. But the man reached out and pounded his heavy fist against the solid wood, the loud booming sound echoing violently through the empty foyer. "I know you're in there." A deep, gravelly voice barked through the thick door. "Open up right now, or I will kick this entire frame off its hinges." My breath caught in my throat. I'm a 70-year-old man. I'm in decent physical shape for my age, but I'm no match for a violent giant. However, I also knew that hiding in the shadows like a frightened child wouldn't solve anything. I unlocked the deadbolt and slowly pulled the front door open, leaving the sturdy chain lock securely fastened. "Can I help you, sir?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain as calm and steady as possible. The tattooed man didn't bother with pleasantries. He slammed his heavy boot violently against the bottom of the door, snapping the metal chain lock as if it were made of cheap plastic. The door flew open, knocking me backward into the foyer. I stumbled and fell hard against the hallway wall, my shoulder colliding painfully with the decorative wooden molding. Before I could even catch my breath, the massive man stepped inside my home and slammed the front door shut behind him. He closed the distance between us in 2 long predatory strides. He reached out with a massive calloused hand and grabbed me forcefully by the collar of my worn bathrobe. He hoisted me up against the wall, his thick fingers digging painfully into my collarbone. He leaned in close. I could smell the acrid smell of stale tobacco and cheap cologne radiating from his clothes. He didn't care that I was an elderly, defenseless man. He looked at me with a cold, dead expression that sent a spike of primal fear straight down my spine. "You must be Lucas's father," the man snarled, his deep voice vibrating with terrifying menace. "You are going to deliver a very urgent message to your pathetic, cowardly son for me." I struggled to breathe, my toes barely touching the hardwood floor as he pinned me against the wall. "I don't know what you're talking about," I gasped, my hands instinctively gripping his thick wrists. The man gave a harsh, grating laugh with no trace of humor. He leaned in even closer, his dark, dangerous eyes narrowing into ruthless slits. "Tell your son his offshore bets are officially due," he hissed, every word carrying deadly intent. He thought he could hide his catastrophic losses, but we own him. "You tell him that if we do not get our $800,000 in raw cash by this Friday, we're coming back here. And if we have to come back, this entire house burns down to the ground with you trapped inside it." He released his violent grip on my collar, letting me drop heavily to the floor. I gasped for air, clutching my bruised chest. The huge man turned around, opened the heavy door, and walked out into the fading sunlight without looking back even once, leaving me alone with the reality of my situation. I pulled myself up from the cold floor, aching from where the tattooed man slammed me against the wall. The terrifying reality of his threat hung in the foyer like toxic gas. $800,000 by Friday, or the house would burn with me inside. The timeline was tight, and the danger was immediate. I knew I couldn't stay in Chicago for another night. If I confronted Lucas now, his cartel associates would silence me before I reached the authorities. I needed a fortress and an airtight legal strategy. I adjusted my torn bathrobe and walked back to my bedroom. I packed a small duffel bag and retrieved my heavy leather briefcase from the bottom drawer of my oak dresser. I needed an excuse to leave without raising suspicion. When Natalie and Lucas returned home from work that evening, I was sitting on my bed staring blankly at a framed photograph of my late brother. I deliberately let my hands shake as they walked in. I looked up with tear-filled eyes and told them I had been thinking heavily about the nursing home. I said I was ready to accept my fate and move into the facility on Friday morning, but I had one desperate request. I told them I needed to take a bus down to Indiana to visit my older brother's grave to say a proper goodbye before I was locked away. Natalie didn't hide her relief. She eagerly agreed, her eyes lighting up at the prospect of having me out of the house during the crucial days before the fraudulent sale. She pulled out her smartphone and booked me a cheap bus ticket for the very next morning. She told me to take all the time I needed, assuring me they would handle the packing. They thought they were sending a broken, heavily medicated old man on a pathetic final journey. They had no idea they were giving a seasoned engineer the window I needed to orchestrate their destruction. The following morning, Natalie dropped me off at the downtown bus terminal. I hugged her goodbye, playing the part of the frail elder perfectly. I waited until her sedan disappeared into the city traffic. Then I walked directly to the taxi stand and ordered the driver to take me straight to the international airport. I bypassed the commercial counters and paid for a direct flight to Wyoming using a private credit card Helen and I kept for emergencies. I boarded the plane, gripping my leather briefcase tightly. As the aircraft climbed above the clouds, the heavy anxiety crushing me finally dissipated. Hours later, I stood on the edge of the massive property Helen secretly left me. The Wyoming air was crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of my suburban home. Stretching out before me were 5,000 acres of rolling plains framed by jagged mountains. I saw the heavy machinery of the Mineral Corporation working steadily on the horizon, pumping $50,000 a month into a secure trust my corrupt son knew nothing about. I took a deep breath, drawing strength from the vast landscape. I didn't linger. I had less than 48 hours to execute my legal strike. I walked into the nearby town, a quiet community built around the local mineral industry. I headed straight for the address Helen had listed in her hidden documents. The office belonged to Adrian Cole, a highly respected corporate attorney who managed the complex land. Leases for the estate. I pushed open the glass door and walked into a sleek reception area. I demanded to see Adrian, immediately bypassing the confused receptionist by stating my name in connection to Helen's private trust. Adrian Cole was a tall, imposing man in his late 50s, wearing a tailored suit that radiated efficiency. He welcomed me into his spacious corner office, offering condolences for Helen's recent passing, but I didn't have the time to exchange polite pleasantries. I sat down in the leather chair across from his massive desk and placed my briefcase squarely between us. I popped the brass latches and opened the lid. I watched Adrian's professional composure slip for a fraction of a second as he stared at the $400,000 in bound raw cash sitting next to the original property deed. I looked him directly in the eye and laid out the entire terrifying situation. I told him about the forged power of attorney document, the fake nursing home brochure, and the unlicensed real estate broker Natalie was using to quickly liquidate my home. I explained the massive offshore debt my son accumulated and the violent cartel enforcer who threatened to burn my house to the ground by Friday. I told Adrian that I needed to destroy my son's legal standing and I needed to do it in less than 48 hours. Adrian leaned back in his chair, pressing his fingertips together as he processed the legal battle I was proposing. A sharp smile slowly spread across his face. He told me my son made a catastrophic error by assuming a forged document would grant him absolute power. Adrian moved with remarkable speed. He called his senior paralegal into the office and began issuing rapid, precise instructions. We used a portion of the raw cash to immediately establish a shielded corporate entity. We named the corporation Meridian Holdings. Adrian structured the company using anonymous corporate proxies and blind trusts, ensuring that my name would never publicly appear on any registration documents. Meridian Holdings was a ghost, a massive financial entity that could operate with secrecy. Once the corporate structure was in place and legally registered with the state authorities, Adrian slid a fresh stack of legal transfer documents across the mahogany desk toward me. He handed me a heavy gold fountain pen. He explained that a power of attorney, even a fraudulently notarized one, only grants the proxy the ability to manage assets that are actively owned by the principal individual. If the principal individual no longer owns the asset, the proxy has nothing left to sell. I took the gold pen and pressed the nib against the thick parchment paper. Right there in his quiet, secure Wyoming office, I confidently signed my name, legally transferring the entire deed of my $1.2 million Chicago home out of my personal possession. I gifted the property directly into the impenetrable corporate vault of Meridian Holdings. I set the pen down, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute victory wash over my tired bones. The heavy burden of grief and fear that had been slowly crushing my spirit for 3 weeks was instantly replaced by a cold, calculating sense of ultimate justice. The trap was now fully set, armed, and inescapable. I had successfully stripped them of the very last physical asset they desperately needed to survive. Lucas and Natalie were currently back in Chicago, aggressively negotiating with their shady broker, desperately trying to sell a massive house that I no longer legally own. The flight back to Chicago felt different from my desperate journey to Wyoming. I was no longer a terrified, grieving widower running blindly from a dangerous threat. I was a man returning to a battlefield with an impenetrable shield and a loaded weapon. My mind was razor-sharp, replaying every legal instruction Adrian Cole had given me. But the moment the taxi pulled up to my suburban driveway, I knew I had to bury the engineer and resurrect the broken old man. I let my shoulders sag heavily. I slowed my breathing, dragging my feet across the concrete walkway. When I opened the front door, the house was eerily silent. Most of my belongings were already packed away in sterile cardboard boxes stacked high against the living room walls. Lucas and Natalie had wasted no time preparing the property for the new buyers. They were sitting at the kitchen island, huddled over a laptop, but they immediately jumped up when they heard the heavy door click shut. Natalie rushed over to greet me, her face plastered with that familiar, sickeningly sweet mask of artificial empathy. She gently took my small duffel bag from my hands, treating me as if my bones were made of fragile glass. She asked me how the trip to my brother's grave went, tilting her head to simulate profound compassion. I kept my gaze fixed firmly on the floorboards, forcing my voice to tremble just enough to sound thoroughly exhausted. I told her the journey had taken a massive toll on my fragile heart. I muttered something incoherent about how much I missed Helen rubbing my eyes to fee in a wave of overwhelming lethargy. Lucas stepped into the hallway, his arms crossed. Over his chest, his eyes scanning my face to verify that the toxic modified pills he thought I was taking were still doing their intended job. I gave him a weak, vacant nod, playing the heavily medicated victim to absolute perfection. "You look tired, Dad," Lucas said softly, guiding me by the elbow toward the empty living room. "You should really go lie down and get some rest. But before you go to sleep, we just need you to handle one tiny piece of administrative paperwork. The real estate broker found a wonderful family who wants to buy the house, and we're closing the deal tomorrow morning. We just need your final official consent to push the sale through." Natalie smoothly pulled a thick stack of stapled documents from her sleek leather portfolio. She placed a heavy brass pen on top of the papers and slid them gently across the glass coffee table. I stared down at the bold black letters printing the words "consent to sell real estate property." My heart hammered against my ribs, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was out of pure, unadulterated irony. They were eager to sell a $1 million asset that had already been securely locked inside a Wyoming corporate vault 24 hours ago. I reached out for the brass pen, intentionally letting my fingers shake uncontrollably. I gripped the cool metal hovering the nib over the designated signature line. I looked up at Natalie and Lucas, my eyes wide and pleading, perfectly simulating the terror of a confused elder signing his life away. Natalie offered a reassuring maternal nod. I pressed the pen to the paper. Instead of my usual precise, structured signature, I deliberately crafted a messy, jagged, barely legible scroll. I let the pen slip slightly at the end, creating a clumsy streak of dark blue ink across the bottom of the page. It looked exactly like the desperate, uncoordinated signature of a man whose mind was failing him. Lucas quickly snatched the document off the glass table. The very second I lifted the pen, he couldn't even hide the flash of greedy triumph that instantly illuminated his face. He checked the messy signature, exchanged a highly satisfied glance with Natalie, and carefully tucked the legal papers back into her leather portfolio. They both let out a synchronized breath of profound relief. The major hurdle was cleared. They honestly believed they were going to be multimillionaires. By tomorrow afternoon, I slowly pushed myself up from the sofa, groaning softly, and began my pathetic dragging shuffle down the hallway toward my master bedroom. I closed my door, but I didn't latch it completely. I left a tiny microscopic crack open so I could hear the immediate aftermath of my performance. Faint muffled sounds drifted down the quiet corridor. I heard the distinct sharp pop of wine cork being pulled from a bottle. I heard the soft clinking of crystal glasses in the kitchen. They were actively celebrating their victory. They were drinking expensive wine, toasting to their impending wealth, oblivious to the massive, inescapable trap that was already tightly closed around their ankles. I waited for an entire hour. I sat perfectly still in the dark, waiting for the house to grow silent. I knew they would eventually retreat to the upstairs guest room to finalize their tropical escape plans. When I finally heard their bedroom door click shut on the second floor, I moved. I opened my duffel bag and pulled out a small, highly advanced micro-audio recorder I had purchased from a specialized electronics store in Wyoming. As an engineer, I always appreciated reliable, high-quality technology. The tiny device was no bigger than a standard coin equipped with a powerful long-range directional microphone and a secure Bluetooth transmitter. I slipped out of my bedroom and crept silently back into the dark, empty living room. The moonlight cast long shadows over the stacks of moving boxes. I crawled on my hands and knees across the bare floorboards, making no sound. I reached a glass coffee table where I had just signed my fake consent forms. I reached underneath the heavy wooden base of the table, found a hidden recessed groove, and firmly pressed the adhesive side of the extremely small recording device against the wood. It was perfectly concealed, totally invisible from any normal standing or sitting angle in the room. I quickly retreated to my bedroom, locked the door securely, and sat down heavily on the edge of my mattress. I pulled the sleek wireless Bluetooth receiver from my pocket and placed the small earpiece deeply into my right ear. The technology was flawless. The connection was established instantly, free of any static or interference. The digital clock on my bedside table glowed a harsh, bright red in the darkness. It was exactly 2 o'clock. In the morning, I stared at the numbers, feeling a cold, intense wave of anticipation washing over my entire body. I knew Natalie and Lucas were heavily stressed about their serious debt. I knew they wouldn't be able to sleep tonight. They would inevitably come downstairs to pace the living room and discuss their final desperate strategy for tomorrow morning. While I took a deep, stunning breath, letting the absolute silence of the suburban night settle around me, I reached down, firmly pressed my thumb against the small, glowing blue button on the side of the compact receiver, and quietly hit play. I pressed the small, glowing blue button on the side of the wireless receiver and held my breath. For a brief second, there was nothing but the soft, rhythmic hum of digital static, then the clear audio feed flooded directly into my right ear. The hidden microphone was exceptionally powerful. I could hear the faint ambient hum of the living room refrigerator in the background. I could hear the distinct sound of liquid being poured into crystal glasses, followed by the sharp, celebratory clink of a toast. Natalie and Lucas were sitting right above the hidden device. Their voices were so sharp and immediate that they might as well have been sitting on the edge of my mattress. "I honestly can't believe we actually pulled this off," Lucas said, his voice thick with a mixture of profound relief and arrogant triumph. I thought the old man was going to put up a fight. I thought he was going to demand to read every single line of that consent form before he picked up the pen. Natalie let out a short, dismissive laugh. "I told you there was nothing to worry about, Lucas. You give him far too much credit. Your father has been checked out ever since we increased the dosage in his morning capsules." He could barely hold the pen straight. His signature looked like it was drawn by a blind child. The broker didn't even question it for a single second. He just saw the ink on the paper and validated the transaction. I heard the soft thud of a glass being set down on the heavy wooden coffee table. "So, what is the timeline for tomorrow?" Lucas asked, his tone shifting into a sharp, businesslike cadence. "When does the money actually clear the escrow account? We can't afford a single delay with these cartel people. That enforcer made it clear that Friday is our absolute deadline. Before things get physically violent." "The timeline is perfect," Natalie replied smoothly. "The buyer is wiring the full $1.2 million directly into our joint offshore account by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, the absolute second the funds clear the international holding period. I'm electronically transferring the $800,000 straight to the syndicate's routing number. That wipes our serious debt clean. They will have their money a full 24 hours before their Friday deadline. The cartel will back off and we will finally be free." "And the remaining $400,000, Lucas asked, the greed practically dripping from his eager voice. "That is our fresh start," Natalie said confidently. "I already booked our first-class tickets. We are leaving for the Bahamas on Thursday night. I secured a beautiful secluded beachfront villa on a long-term lease. We can live like absolute royalty down there for years while we figure out our next major move. We just need to pack our bags and walk out the front door. There was a brief, comfortable silence on the audio feed as they both likely visualized their upcoming tropical escape. Then Lucas shifted in his seat. The leather sofa creaked loudly through the earpiece. "What about, Dad?" Lucas asked, his voice devoid of any familial affection. He sounded like he was discussing a broken piece of luggage that needed to be hauled to the local dump. "Are we still dropping him off at that low-income nursing home on Thursday afternoon before we head to the airport? We need to make sure he is securely locked away so he can't wander into a police station and try to report the house." Sail as fraud when his head finally clears? Natalie let out a high, chilling laugh that sent a massive spike of pure ice straight down my spine. It was a sound of absolute predatory malice. "I canceled the nursing home reservation 3 days ago, Lucas," Natalie said, her tone dripping with dark amusement. "That glossy brochure I left on the coffee table was just a visual prop to keep him docile. We can't risk putting him in a standard assisted living facility. Even a terrible underfunded nursing home allows patients to make phone calls, receive visitors, and eventually talk to a social worker. If his heavy medication wears off and he suddenly regains his sharp memory, he could easily cause a massive legal headache for us from a nursing home. So where exactly is he going?" Lucas asked, sounding more curious than concerned. "I called the state psychiatric asylum," Natalie revealed coldly. "I used the forged power of attorney and the highlighted medical chart from Dr. Bennett to secure an involuntary permanent commitment order. They are sending a secure medical transport van to pick the old man up first thing on Friday morning. We will already be sitting on a beautiful beach in the Bahamas by the time they arrive to haul him away." "The state asylum," Lucas repeated, a hint of genuine surprise coloring his voice. "Is that not a highly restricted lockdown facility?" "Exactly," Natalie confirmed with ruthless satisfaction. "They specialize in severe, unmanageable dementia patients and aggressive psychiatric cases. Once he is admitted into their system, he becomes a permanent ward of the state. He will be stripped of his personal clothing, his phone, and his identity. They will keep him heavily sedated around the clock to manage his fabricated delusions. The specific ward I assigned him to is located in the basement level of their oldest building. There are no windows in that ward, Lucas. He will never see the sunlight again, and he will never ever be able to contact the outside world to tell his pathetic story. He will simply vanish." I sat alone in the crushing darkness of my bedroom, clutching the wireless receiver so tightly that the hard plastic casing dug painfully into my palm. The sheer, unadulterated evil of their master plan was almost incomprehensible. They weren't just stealing my home and fleeing the country. They were intentionally condemning me to a living nightmare. They were sentencing me to spend the final years of my life locked inside a windowless concrete cell pumped full of heavy chemical sedatives, until my mind actually did rot away into nothingness. My own flesh and blood had calmly signed my life away for a luxurious vacation in the Bahamas. A deep, terrifying silence settled over me as I listened to them joyfully clink their crystal wine glasses together one more time in the kitchen. I thought the absolute worst of their betrayal had already been and fully exposed. I honestly thought there was nothing else left in this entire world that could possibly shock me or break my heart any further. But the quiet, hushed conversation echoing continuously through my earpiece didn't end with their sinister asylum plan. The digital audio feed crackled slightly as Lucas leaned closer to his wife, lowering his voice into a tight, nervous whisper. The final, deeply devastating secret was about to abruptly drop into the silence, and it would shatter my soul forever. I sat on my mattress. I pressed the earpiece deeper into my ear, straining to catch every single syllable. The ambient noise in the living room seemed to fade away, leaving only the sharp, nervous friction of Lucas shifting his weight on the leather sofa. When he finally spoke again, his voice was no longer filled with the arrogant triumph of a man who had just successfully stolen his father's estate. It was trembling, frail, and heavy with a sudden suffocating paranoia. "What about Mom?" Lucas whispered the question hanging in the air like a thick, poisonous fog. "What if Dr. Bennett ever says something to him? What if Dad ever finds out what we actually did?" My heart skipped a violent beat. My breathing stopped entirely. I sat perfectly still in the crushing darkness of my bedroom, my entire body going rigid with an instinctual primal dread. I had no idea what he was talking about. Helen had passed away from a sudden aggressive illness. It was a tragedy, a terrible twist of fate that had broken my world into a million pieces. There was nothing for me to find out. "Keep your voice down," Natalie hissed, her tone instantly dropping into a harsh, venomous warning. "No one is ever going to find out anything, Lucas. You are letting your nerves get the absolute best of you. Dr. Bennett is not going to say a single word. He is legally bound by hospital confidentiality, and he honestly believes we were just following her advanced medical directives, but we weren't following her directives." Lucas stammered, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. She was trying to communicate with the nurses. She was trying to stay awake. What if Dad eventually requests the detailed medical logs? What if he ever finds out we authorized the hospital administration to unplug her ventilator 2 days early just so she couldn't sign her new will? The digital audio feed continued to broadcast their hushed conversation, but I could no longer hear the words over the deafening roaring sound of my own blood rushing through my ears. The bedroom began to physically spin around me. I felt a massive suffocating weight slam directly into my chest, stealing all the oxygen from my lungs. I reached out and gripped the edge of my heavy oak knitstand, my fingers digging desperately into the wood to keep myself from collapsing onto the floor. I closed my eyes, and a vivid, excruciatingly painful memory instantly flooded my mind. I remembered the sterile, glaring, fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit. I remembered sitting beside Helen's hospital bed, holding her frail, cold hand for hours on end. She had been weak, fighting a massive infection that ravaged her body, but she had been fighting. I remembered the moment the attending physician had pulled me aside in the quiet hallway. He had looked at me with deep sympathy and told me that her organs were failing, that keeping her on the mechanical ventilator was only prolonging her profound suffering. I had trusted that medical assessment completely. I had wept uncontrollably, believing that letting her go was the final merciful act of a loving husband. I remember the cold chill of the hospital room as I held her hand one last time, begging her for forgiveness for not being able to save her from the pain. I had kissed her forehead, told her how much I loved her, and stood by in absolute agony as the nurses silenced the machines and allowed her to slip away into the dark. But that was a lie. It was all a massive, carefully orchestrated, sickening lie. She was going to change her estate planning, Lucas, Natalie said, her voice devoid of any human soul. She told me her lawyer was coming to the hospital on Thursday morning to draft a new living trust. She was going to lock the majority of her liquid assets into a secure generation skipping fund for any future grandchildren. She was going to cut off our direct access to the primary inheritance accounts. We couldn't afford to let that happen. We needed that upfront capital to satisfy the first round of offshore margin calls. If she had signed those new documents, we would have been ruined. "I know," Lucas whispered, his voice trembling with a cowardice that made me physically ill. "I know why we had to do it. But it was still my mother, Natalie." We walked into that administrative office, claimed Dad was too emotionally compromised to make the hard medical choices, and we used our emergency proxy to sign the termination orders. "We killed her." "We didn't kill her," Natalie snapped back, her tone radiating pure, unadulterated evil. Her body was already failing. We simply expedited the inevitable process to protect our financial future. It was a difficult business decision, Lucas, and it worked. We got the inheritance payout. We secured the house. And now we're leaving for the Caribbean. You need to bury that guilt right now. The old man is being shipped to a windowless asylum on Friday morning. There is no one left to ask any questions. I slowly opened my eyes. The suffocating wave of profound grief that had been drowning me for 3 weeks evaporated into the cold, silent air of the bedroom. The terrible, gnawing sadness of losing my wife was instantly burned away by a blazing, catastrophic inferno of absolute rage. The intense burning fury coursing through my veins was so powerful that it made my hands stop shaking. My mind achieved a terrifying, flawless clarity. I was no longer a mourning widower. I was a man who had just uncovered a murder. I had spent my entire life working tirelessly to provide a beautiful, comfortable world for my son. I had sacrificed my own dreams, working grueling hours on dangerous oil rigs just to make sure he never had to experience a single day of hardship. I had loved him with every fiber of my being. But the man sitting in my living room drinking my expensive wine and planning a tropical vacation was no longer my son. He was a monster. He was a ruthless, calculating predator who had partnered with a sociopath to systematically destroy his own family for money. They had weaponized my profound love for my wife. They had taken advantage of my debilitating grief to slowly poison my mind, intending to lock me inside a concrete cell for the rest of my natural life, stripping me of every fundamental human right I possessed just to cover their tracks. But that was only the secondary crime. The true depth of their depravity was so much worse than anything I could have ever possibly imagined. The financial fraud, the fake nursing home, the stolen house, it all palled in comparison to the horrifying truth echoing in my ear. My blood turns to ice. They didn't just abandon me to save themselves from a violent cartel debt. They actively shortened my wife's life to secure their inheritance window before it permanently closed. She was brain dead, Lucas. Natalie snapped back on the recording, her voice echoing with a sickening metallic hollow that stripped away any remaining trace of her humanity. Keeping her alive on those machines was costing us thousands of dollars a day in specialized care that insurance was already threatening to deny. She was never going to wake up. And more importantly, her prolonged lingering gave us the absolute perfect window to secure the power of attorney, while your father was too busy crying at her bedside to notice what he was signing. We made the right call. We did what had to be done to protect our assets. I sat motionless in the suffocating darkness of my bedroom. The earpiece delivered her cruel, calculated words straight into my mind, but they no longer felt like a heavy, blunt impact. Instead, they felt like a sudden plunge into freezing Arctic water. Every single trace of the debilitating grief that had weighed down my shoulders for the past 3 weeks evaporated. The overwhelming, crushing sorrow of losing my wife was instantly eradicated, burned away by a cold, clinical, and cold clarity. I was no longer a mourning father. I was no longer a confused, broken old man waiting to be shipped away to a windowless asylum. I was a structural engineer. I had spent 40 years of my professional life analyzing catastrophic failures, identifying weak points in massive offshore platforms, and systematically dismantling immense structures under extreme pressure. I closed my eyes and allowed the analytical predator side of my brain to fully awaken. I stopped viewing Lucas as my flesh and blood. I stripped away the decades of fatherly affection, the memories of teaching him how to ride a bicycle, the pride of paying for his expensive business school. I forcefully severed all emotional ties to the boy I had raised, actively reducing him and his ruthless wife to nothing more than a highly dangerous, unstable variable in a complex mathematical equation. They were a critical failure in the structural integrity of my family, a cancer that had aggressively consumed my life and murdered my wife for a quick financial payout. And just like any compromised, failing structure, they needed to be meticulously, ruthlessly, and permanently demolished. I listened to the rest of their hushed conversation with absolute, unwavering detachment. Lucas eventually stopped whining about his fabricated guilt, his shallow conscience easily pacified by Natalie's venomous reassurances. They went back to eagerly discussing the specific layout of their luxurious beachfront villa in the Bahamas, debating whether they should hire a private chef or rely on local catering once they arrived. They clinketed their wine glasses one final time, the sharp chime of the crystal sealing their horrifying pact. I heard the heavy squeak of the leather sofa as they finally stood up, followed by the soft padding of their footsteps ascending the carpeted staircase to the guest room. I waited until I heard their bedroom door firmly click shut on the second floor. I slowly reached up and pulled the wireless Bluetooth earpiece from my ear, setting it gently on the edge of the heavy oak nightstand. The silence that rushed back into my bedroom was no longer heavy or oppressive. It felt charged with a vibrant, lethal electric current. I stood up from my mattress. My joints didn't ache. My muscles didn't tremble. I walked over to the large bay window and pulled the heavy curtains tightly shut, ensuring that no stray light from the street lamps outside could illuminate my movements. I had a significant amount of work to do before the sun rose, and I needed to execute every single step with absolute, unforgiving precision. I moved silently around the perimeter of my bedroom, packing a sleek leather overnight bag with the few essential items I would need for the next 48 hours. I folded my crisp-tailored charcoal suit, carefully placing it into a protective garment bag. I selected a pristine white dress shirt and a dark conservative tie. I wasn't going to face them tomorrow morning, looking like a ragged, exhausted victim. I was going to walk into that closing room looking like an executive executioner. I retrieved my heavy leather briefcase from the bottom drawer of the dresser, ensuring that the remaining bounds of raw cash, the official Wyoming ranch documents, and the freshly minted corporate records for Meridian Holdings were secure. I locked the brass latches with a satisfying metallic snap. I spent the remaining hours of the night sitting perfectly still in a high-backed reading chair in the corner of my bedroom. I didn't sleep for a single second. I mentally rehearsed the upcoming confrontation, calculating every possible variable, anticipating every potential reaction from my corrupt son and his treacherous wife. I mapped out the timing of Adrian Cole's arrival, the strategic positioning of the federal agents, and the precise moment I would drop the heavy, inescapable hammer on their entire existence. I was going to rip their glamorous, deceitful lives apart, piece by piece, dollar by dollar, until there was nothing left but the terrifying realization of their own catastrophic failure. The digital clock on my nightstand slowly ticked forward, the bright red numbers marking the final hours of their stolen freedom. Eventually, the pitch-black sky outside my window began to soften into a pale, bruised purple. The quiet suburban neighborhood slowly woke up oblivious to the massive, life-altering explosion that was about to detonate. I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of footsteps moving around on the second floor, the shower in the guest bathroom. Clicked on the water, rushing loudly through the pipes behind the walls. Lucas and Natalie were awake. I remained perfectly hidden in the shadows of my locked bedroom, listening as they confidently prepared for the most important day of their miserable lives. I could smell the rich scent of freshly brewed coffee drifting down the long hallway. I heard Natalie humming a cheerful melody as she moved around the kitchen island. They were ignorant of the massive trap that was already tightly closed around their necks. They honestly believed that today they would collect their stolen millions, pay off the violent cartel enforcer, and board a first-class flight to a tropical paradise while I rotted away in a dark concrete cell. The heavy front door clicked open and slammed shut. I peeked through the narrow slit in my bedroom blinds. The morning sun was bright and clear. Lucas and Natalie were striding confidently down the concrete driveway. They were both dressed impeccably in sharp, tailored designer suits carrying sleek leather portfolios, their faces radiating an aura of absolute arrogance. They climbed into their luxury sedan and backed out into the street, heading straight to the Real Estate broker's office to collect their final massive payout. The moment their car turned the corner and disappeared from view, I grabbed my things, stepped out into the hallway, and prepared to follow them. It was closing day, and I was going to make certain that the final door closed directly on them. I stepped out of the dark shadows of my home and walked down the quiet suburban street to where I had parked my rental car the night before. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. I kept a safe, deliberate distance behind Lucas and Natalie as their luxury sedan navigated the early morning commute toward the bustling city. The drive took just under an hour, but to me it felt like an eternity, suspended in pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I watched their vehicle weave effortlessly through the dense Chicago traffic, moving closer and closer to the downtown financial district. My hands rested steadily on the steering wheel. I didn't feel any lingering sorrow. I didn't feel the crushing, suffocating weight of a father about to destroy his only child. The man driving this car was a structural engineer actively preparing a controlled, devastating demolition. I thought about Helen. I thought about the cold, sterile hospital room where they had heartlessly silenced her life support machines just to protect their greedy, desperate financial timeline. That single horrific memory solidified the cold steel in my spine. They were going to pay dearly for every single precious second they stole from her. They finally pulled into the underground parking garage of a sleek, modern high-rise building located right in the beating heart of the city. I parked a level above them, waited a few calculated moments, and took the elevator up to the main lobby. The real estate brokerage firm occupied the entire 14th floor. It was an ostentatious office, clearly designed to project immense wealth and success to high-net-worth clients. The walls were lined with abstract, modern art, and the floors were polished white marble that brilliantly reflected the bright morning sunlight, streaming through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. I stepped off the elevator and stood quietly near a large decorative potted plant, observing the main reception area from a secure, safe distance. Through the thick glass walls of the primary conference room, I could clearly see Lucas and Natalie. They were sitting side by side at a massive mahogany table. Natalie was nervously crossing and uncrossing her legs, her stylish high heel tapping rapidly against the thick carpet. Lucas was constantly checking his expensive gold wristwatch, his face a tight mask of barely contained frantic anticipation. They were eagerly waiting for the anonymous buyer to walk through that heavy glass door and hand them a certified cashier check for $1.2 million. They honestly, truly believed their terrifying nightmare was over forever. I pulled my smartphone from my inner jacket pocket and checked the digital time. It was exactly 8:45 in the morning. The official closing was scheduled for 9. I looked toward the main elevator bank at the far end of the expansive marble lobby, the polished metal doors slid open with a soft melodic chime. Adrian Cole stepped out into the bright hallway. He was wearing an impeccably tailored navy blue suit, holding his sleek leather briefcase firmly in his right hand. He looked like an apex predator entering a shallow pool filled with vulnerable prey. He spotted me immediately and offered a sharp, curt nod of silent acknowledgement. We had spent the last 48 hours aggressively coordinating this exact moment down to the very last second. He had contacted the appropriate federal authorities the very moment he secured the legal transfer of my property into the impenetrable Wyoming corporate vault. We had provided them with undeniable concrete proof of the forged power of attorney, the attempted wire fraud, and the ongoing malicious conspiracy to sell a stolen high-value asset across state lines. The trap was no longer just a messy civil dispute over family money. It was a massive, airtight federal crime with severe legal consequences. I took a deep, fortifying breath and smoothed the crisp lapels of my dark charcoal suit. I adjusted my silk tie, ensuring my physical posture was rigid and commanding. I was no longer the hunched, shuffling, heavily medicated victim they had left behind in the kitchen just 2 hours ago. I walked out from behind the decorative plant and strode purposefully across the gleaming white marble floor. My polished dress shoes clicked sharply against the stone, creating a steady, rhythmic march toward justice. I approached the clear, glass-walled conference room with unwavering determination. The young, unlicensed real estate broker was sitting at the head of the long table, hastily organizing a thick stack of final closing documents. Lucas and Natalie were leaning forward in their plush seats, their eager eyes fixed hungrily on the frosted glass door, ready to welcome the wealthy buyer who was about to miraculously save their lives. I reached out and firmly grasped the heavy stainless steel handle. I turned the handle slowly and pushed the thick door wide open. The heavy glass swung inward with a smooth, silent glide. I stepped confidently into the bright conference room and let the heavy door slowly close behind me with a soft, definitive click. The sudden violent shift in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous and palpable, the polite, welcoming, perfectly rehearsed smile on Natalie's face shattered the very second her dark eyes landed on my tailored suit. Lucas physically jumped in his leather chair, a loud, sharp gasp escaping his throat, as if all the oxygen had been violently punched directly out of his lungs. They stared at me in total, unadulterated horror. They were looking at a ghost. They were looking at the frail, heavily medicated old man they firmly believed they had securely locked away in a suburban kitchen, unaware that he had just transformed into their absolute worst nightmare. I didn't say a single word. I simply stood at the end of the long mahogany table, keeping my posture perfectly straight, my shoulders squared and my hands resting calmly at my sides. I locked my eyes directly onto Lucas, the sheer naked panic radiating from his pale, trembling face was satisfying to witness. He opened his mouth to speak, to stammer out some pathetic, fabricated excuse for why I was standing there, but his vocal cords failed him. The profound, suffocating silence in the room was deafening. The unlicensed broker looked back and forth between us, confused by the sudden, terrifying tension that had just hijacked his highly lucrative morning. I watched Natalie slowly reach into her designer purse, her shaking fingers frantically searching for her cell phone, realizing that their brilliant, flawless escape plan had just encountered a massive, catastrophic failure. She was desperately looking for a quick, invisible way out of the terrifying situation they had so carelessly created for themselves. But there was no escape from the relentless, crushing gravity of their horrifying crimes. I held my gaze steady, letting them drown in their own sudden, overwhelming terror. And then the heavy stainless steel handle of the conference room door turned for a second time. Right behind me stood Adrian Cole, holding a sleek leather briefcase flanked by two fully armed federal agents. The glass door clicked shut behind the federal agents, sealing the room like a vault. Lucas remained frozen in his expensive leather chair, his jaw hanging slightly open as his mind desperately struggled to process the impossible scene. He looked from me to the federal agents and back to me, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat, coming out as a stammer. He raised his trembling hands, gesturing wildly toward the briefcase resting on the mahogany table. He asked what was going on, his voice cracking under his sudden panic. He looked at Natalie silently, begging her to deploy a manipulative lie, but she was paralyzed. The arrogant aura she possessed just 10 minutes ago had evaporated, leaving behind nothing but raw terror. The unlicensed real estate broker pushed his chair back, violently, the metal legs scraping loudly against the polished floor. He asked what was going on, his voice cracking under his sudden panic. He looked at Natalie silently, begging her to deploy a manipulative lie, but she was paralyzed. The arrogant aura she possessed just 10 minutes ago had evaporated, leaving behind nothing but raw terror. The unlicensed real estate broker pushed his chair back, violently, the metal legs scraping loudly against the polished floor. He held his hands up in absolute surrender, rapidly muttering that he had no idea what was happening and was just an independent contractor. He swore he knew nothing about any underlying criminal activity. Adrian Cole ignored the panicking broker entirely. He walked with a calm, predatory grace toward the head of the long conference table, his polished dress shoes silent on the thick carpet. He placed his sleek leather briefcase down on the smooth mahogany surface and popped the brass latches with a sharp snap. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, meticulously organized legal file. He didn't look at Lucas or Natalie with anger. He looked at them with the cold clinical detachment of an exterminator examining a severe pest problem. He tossed the heavy file onto the center of the table. The thick stack of papers slid across the polished wood, stopping mere inches from Natalie's trembling hands. Adrian adjusted his tailored suit jacket and cleared his throat, commanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room. He spoke with a deep, resonant voice that carried the undeniable weight of legal authority. "Allow me to formally introduce my client." He began gesturing respectfully toward me. You may know him as your father, but in the professional financial sector, he is recognized as the sole proprietor and acting chief executive officer of Meridian Holdings. Lucas stared at Adrian in confusion, his brow deeply furrowed as his panicked brain desperately tried to connect the dots. He repeated the name Meridian Holdings out loud, the unfamiliar corporate title tasting like ash in his mouth. Natalie swallowed hard, her dark eyes darting frantically toward the heavy file resting on the table. Adrian offered them a sharp, humorless smile. He calmly explained that Meridian Holdings was a privately managed investment firm with a substantial liquid capital available for immediate deployment. He stated that earlier this week, Meridian Holdings utilized its corporate channels to reach out to a specific unregulated offshore lending entity. Adrian leaned forward, placing both of his hands flat on the mahogany table. Meridian Holdings just legally purchased your delinquent $800,000 debt directly from the underground syndicate via secure corporate channels, he announced, letting the scale of his words hang heavily in the silent room. We bought your paper at a premium to ensure a rapid, unquestioned transfer of financial liability. The dangerous men who were threatening to burn you alive are no longer looking for you. You no longer owe them a single dime. For a brief, agonizingly stupid second, a profound wave of relief washed over Lucas's pale face. He actually believed that I had intervened to save his miserable life. He thought that the pathetic, forgiving father he had constantly manipulated had rushed in at the very last minute to financially rescue him from his catastrophic mistakes. He let out a long, shaky breath and looked up at me with fresh tears welling in his cowardly eyes. But Adrian Cole wasn't finished delivering the devastating sequence of perfectly timed explosions. He reached out and tapped his index finger sharply against the top page of the legal file. However, Adrian continued his tone, dropping into a lethal, icy register. Because Meridian Holdings absorbed your financial liability, we're now your sole exclusive creditors, and unfortunately, we demand immediate total repayment in full. Natalie finally found her voice, though it sounded like dry leaves. She pointed a shaking finger at the closing documents spread across the table. She aggressively stated that they were closing on the house right now, and they would securely have the cash to pay the debt in less than an hour. Adrian let out a short, sharp laugh that lacked any warmth. He shook his head slowly, looking at Natalie with genuine, unadulterated pity. That is where you have encountered an insurmountable legal problem, he said smoothly. You see, you can't legally sell a property that you do not actually own. Natalie's face instantly went pale. All the blood drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking physically ill. She stammered that she had a valid notarized power of attorney document that explicitly granted her husband the legal right to liquidate his father's primary estate. Adrian nodded in polite agreement, conceding that her forged document might have functioned perfectly under different circumstances. But a power of attorney only applies to assets currently held by the principal individual. Adrian explained, his voice ringing with finality. Mr. Thomas legally transferred the entire deed of his suburban Chicago property out of his personal name merely a month ago. He gifted the entire estate into the impenetrable corporate vault of Meridian Holdings. We officially own the house. You have spent the entire morning aggressively attempting to sell an asset that belongs to a private corporation. The reality of their position finally crashed down on them. Natalie slumped back into her leather chair, her breath coming in short gasps as the invisible noose finally pulled tight around her neck. She looked down at the forged consent forms she had so eagerly presented to the broker just minutes ago, suddenly realizing they weren't her ticket to a tropical paradise, but rather her signed confession to a serious crime. Lucas began to shake violently, burying his face in his trembling hands as he let out a low, pathetic moan of pure despair. The unlicensed real estate broker silently grabbed his personal briefcase and attempted to slip out the back door, but the two armed federal agents stepped forward, blocking his only route of escape. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern expression, reached into his dark suit jacket and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic clinking Sound echoed ominously in the tense, silent conference room. The agent looked directly at Lucas and Natalie, his voice projecting the terrifying weight of the federal justice system. Because they attempted to sell an asset they didn't own using a forged power of attorney document across state lines, they committed first-degree federal wire fraud. There was no escape from the permanent consequences of their actions. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut around Natalie's wrists, the sharp metallic sound cutting through the stunned silence of the conference room. Her legs gave out completely. She collapsed against the edge of the mahogany table, letting out a raw, guttural sound of pure panic as the federal agent firmly secured her arms behind her back. All of her arrogant confidence, her calculating cruelty evaporated in an instant. She looked like a terrified, trapped animal, realizing that the cage door had just been permanently locked. Lucas didn't try to run. He didn't try to fight. He simply crumbled. He fell heavily to his knees right there on the polished marble floor, his expensive designer suit wrinkling around his shaking body. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking violently as deep, pathetic sobs tore through his chest. The reality of his ruin had finally broken his mind. He looked up at me, his face streaked with hot tears, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading terror. "Dad," Lucas cried out, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch, "I'm so sorry. Please, you have to stop this. You can't do this to us. I'm your son." I looked down at the man kneeling on the floor. I searched my heart for a single ounce of pity for any lingering trace of a father's protective instinct. I found nothing but cold, hardened steel. My voice was devoid of any emotion when I finally answered him. "This house stopped being yours a month ago." I said every word landing like a heavy final blow. "And you stopped being my son the day you walked into that hospital and unplugged your mother's machine." Lucas let out a horrified, agonized wail. He knew in that precise moment that I had heard the audio recording. He knew that his darkest, most unforgivable sin had been fully exposed. The second federal agent hauled him roughly to his feet, securing his wrists tightly in cold steel. Lucas tried to reach out toward me, begging for a mercy he didn't deserve, but the agents firmly dragged him backward. Natalie was weeping uncontrollably, her makeup running down her pale cheeks in dark streaks as she was marched out of the glass doors. I stood perfectly still, watching them being paraded away through the crowded real estate lobby in handcuffs. The unlicensed broker sat frozen in his chair, paralyzed by the scale of the federal raid that had just destroyed his lucrative morning. He looked down at his trembling hands, aware that his own illegal business practices were about to be heavily scrutinized by the authorities. The receptionist in the outer hallway gasped out loud, dropping a stack of pristine white papers onto the floor as the agents physically pushed Lucas and Natalie toward the main elevator bank. Everyone in the luxurious office building was staring at them, their glamorous lives officially over in a single devastating heartbeat. They were utterly humiliated in front of their wealthy peers, stripped of the arrogant facade they had worn for years. Adrian Cole stood quietly beside me, patiently, packing his heavy legal files back into his sleek leather briefcase. He closed the brass latches with a solid definitive snap, offering me a silent nod of profound mutual respect. We walked out of the conference room together, leaving the terrified broker behind us. The nightmare was over. The nightmare had been cut out of my life for good. 3 months later, the air out here in Wyoming is crisp and clean, untouched by the suffocating smog of the city. I'm standing on the wide wooden porch of the massive ranch that Helen secretly left me, leaning gently against the sturdy railing outside. The morning sun is just beginning to rise over the jagged mountain peaks, casting a brilliant golden glow across the 5,000 acres of lush green plains stretching out as far as my eyes can see. In the distance, a small herd of wild horses grazes peacefully near a winding river. The heavy machinery of the Mineral Corporation continues its steady, rhythmic work on the horizon, quietly securing my financial independence. I do not feel lonely out here in this vast open space. I feel a deep sense of freedom. The legal fallout back in Chicago happened quickly, It was swift and devastating for them. Lucas and Natalie are currently sitting in federal holding facilities awaiting a criminal trial that will inevitably sentence them to decades in a maximum security prison. They tried to plead for leniency, but the audio recordings and the paper trail of their massive offshore debts provided the prosecution with an airtight case. The underground cartel enforcer who threatened my life was swept up in a massive federal raid orchestrated by the authorities using the intelligence Adrian gathered. The dangerous syndicate was dismantled, removing the final lingering threat permanently from my existence. As for the massive house in the Chicago suburbs, I decided I never wanted to step foot inside those walls ever again. The memories there had been too deeply tainted by their greed and betrayal. Instead of selling it for profit, I instructed Adrian to execute a legal transfer of the property deed to a respected local charity. The sprawling 5-bedroom home has now been renovated and converted into a free full-time medical clinic and safe haven for elderly individuals who have been abandoned or abused by their own families. The place where my son planned to discard me is now a fortress of hope and healing for people who truly need it. It felt like the fitting answer over his dark intentions. I take a slow, deep sip of my hot black coffee, letting the rich, bitter taste ground me in the present moment. I look up at the wide, endless blue sky, watching a solitary hawk circle effortlessly on the morning thermal currents. A gentle, cooling breeze sweeps across the porch, rustling the leaves of the old oak tree standing near the front wooden steps. I close my eyes, letting the peace of the ranch wash over my tired soul. For the first time since that terrible day in the hospital, the crushing weight of grief has lifted. I do not feel broken anymore. I feel whole. I smile knowing that I honored her legacy by protecting myself and delivering the ultimate justice. I take another breath of the fresh mountain air, and for the very first time in months I can actually feel Helen standing right beside me. We are together again in spirit, watching the beautiful sunrise over the vast Wyoming landscape. I know she is proud of the difficult choices I made to defend our family honor. The long, painful chapter of betrayal is finally closed. A peaceful new chapter of my life has begun, and I'm ready to embrace it. Blood doesn't guarantee loyalty, and love should never blind you to the truth. When you spend your entire life sacrificing for your family, it's easy to ignore the obvious red flags of entitlement and greed. But true wisdom comes with age and the realization that trust must be earned, not blindly given. Evil often wears the familiar face of the very people we care for the most. Do not let sentimentality make you a helpless victim. Stand up, protect your legacy, and never let those who betray you dictate your final chapter.